the years, Janet and I have been blessed to attend what some would call galas or galas. Some of them for work, others for the city of Meridian. We've been to what you would call black tie affairs, like the one you see on the screen before you. Thinking back, I think it's ironic because a lot of those parties happened after I was named Volunteer of the Year for the city of Meridian in 2013. It's hard, if I'm honest, not to let some of that go to your head. These were functions that we went to because we wanted to go. We also went because the mayor was going to be there. Because some of the influential business people, of course, would be in attendance. Now, as a couple, we made some great memories, and I wouldn't trade those memories for the world. These parties, these gatherings were important at the time, and I guess you could say that we did make an impression on the influential people of the city. I have to admit to you now that we went to some of those parties, and honestly, I can't recall why we went or even what they were for. As you can see on the photo, there were several times where there was a dress code for the party we were attending. Our society that we live in today says these parties, these gatherings are important. But are they really? In the large scheme of life, are these parties really all that important? See, I want you to understand that parties have taken place for centuries and for different reasons. Some of the parties have great significance. Others are just a party, an excuse, if you will, for people to get together with one another. You may find it hard to believe, but Jesus himself attended parties. We have the one where he attended the wedding reception, if you will, and they ran out of wine. Some of his parables even had parties in them, like the one we're going to take an in-depth look at today. This time, we're going to take an in-depth look at a parable called the Wedding Banquet, and it's my hope that after this sermon, that you all have a different perspective on the parable that I hope you've heard several times over the last few years. But I want you to understand that as Christians, we've all been invited to a party. And it's our mission as followers of Christ to make sure that everyone knows about that party. Yes, even those that we do not consider worthy of the party at first. Our parable this morning I mentioned from the Gospel of Matthew. But I also want to mention to you that this particular parable can be found in the Gospel of Luke. In Luke's Gospel, it's spoken by Jesus at a banquet in direct response to a remark made by one of the guests about the Feast of the Kingdom. This morning we're going to focus on Matthew's Gospel. In this version of the story, we see in verse 7 that they say they burned their city. At the time this story would have originally been told to its original audience, it was a common military practice, and some say it could be the foretelling of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. I want to continue to look at this parable and drop down with you to verse 11. He says, they're not wearing wedding clothes. See, it may be a custom at the time of this banquet for the host to provide guests with wedding garments. This would have been necessary for guests at the time, but particularly in this situation, as the attendees of this banquet would have been brought from the streets of the city. The failure of the man in question to show up without wedding garments is seen as an insult to the host who probably made those garments available. And we see the use of the term friend in verse 12. I want you to understand that this is not necessarily a compliment to the man. It's meant more in mild rebuke. Verse 13 talks about the gnashing of teeth. And I want to note that this phrase, this gnashing of teeth, occurs 6 times in Matthew's Gospel and nowhere else again in the New Testament. Finally, we have verse 14, which is the proverb summary of the parable itself. See, God invited many to be a part of his kingdom. Sadly, only a few were chosen. And I want you to understand something. God did not choose at random. The invitation God gives all of us must be accepted, and then followed by leading an appropriate life with proper behavior. See, that's the proof that one has been chosen by God. The king in the parable had long ago sent out his invitation. Not until everything was ready did he make his last call to his guests. We notice in the parable that the last call is then refused. We could possibly look at this parable as having two meanings. First of all, a local meaning, the invited guests. When it came time, they refused to come to the party. One might say this was referring to the Jewish people themselves. See, the Jewish people had long ago been invited by God to be his chosen people. Then God sends his Son to come into the world, and they, the Jewish people, when invited to follow Christ, refused him. Our second possible meaning in this particular parable might be speaking of a wider spectrum of people. It reminds us that God's invitation is a joyous feast. God invites all of us to this banquet in joy. It reminds us that the things which men are deaf to, when we're deaf to the invitation of Christ, the things that make us deaf are not in themselves bad. Should also remind you that the appeal of Christ is not so much to be considered on how we'll be punished, but to remind us on what we would miss out on at the banquet. Remember, God gives the invitation. The invitation should be seen as one of grace. Grace gave the invitation, and it's in that grace that we all should gather in. Well, there you have it. Nice and neat from the front side. Now let's look at it from the back side. The people opposing Jesus at the time this parable was told found it difficult to criticize the man. The accusations were that Jesus had attended several of these parties. Big deal. But the real accusation was that Jesus attended these parties with the wrong people. See, Jesus spoke of parties. Parties were a large part of the parables that he told. This one in particular about a party. As he begins, he compares the kingdom of God to a marriage feast. Now, traditionally, we think of a marriage feast as a happy time, and we associate that with the wedding banquet. As I mentioned before, these invitations had gone out several weeks earlier. The guests themselves decline at the last minute. You need to understand that Jesus, by telling this story, is using a dramatic story to help all of us, his original listeners and ourselves, realize how inconceivable our human response is to God's generosity. So the king sends out servants to get the guests, telling them the feast is ready. Come. He hopes to be more convincing, hoping to create a sense of urgency, if you will. The people, they have excuses. We can't attend for such and such a reason. They have better things to do, they tell the servants. Some of the guests were told, grabbed the servants, mistreated them, and in some cases ended up killing those servants. Natural response, the king gets angry. He instructs the servants to go back into the streets and invites everybody. Everybody the servants come in contact with are now invited to the banquet. We have two obvious interpretations of the parable. The first one is that Jesus is telling that original crowd. God originally invited to heaven his chosen people. Those people being the Jewish people themselves. The Jews refuse the invitation, and God eventually sends out messengers. He sends them out into the world to perhaps some very unlikely places where God invites everyone to come to the banquet. Now, to us, what I'm about to say is not unnormal, but to the original audience, Jesus would have said, everybody, Jew and Gentile alike. The second interpretation, if you will, is that the Lord prepared a great celebration. And God invited everyone to the celebration. They refused, just like in the parable, but they had poor excuses. As we look at those coming to the invitation of God, it seems that many of the people who come are what we call unlikely people, meaning that we may see them as people who are unworthy to attend the banquet. Many times when preachers or teachers teach this parable, they focus on the wedding banquet itself. However, today, I'd like to focus our attention on what I call a minor figure. That figure being the unnamed servant. Put yourself in that servant's shoes for a moment. How did the servant feel? Did the response the people gave him as they declined the king, his master's invitation, did that hurt the servant's feelings? Did the servant feel, and these are my words, did the servant feel like he'd like to throttle those people for their ungratefulness? Think of it this way. Can you imagine a young, on-fire Christian? Now, I use the word young, not meaning age. Someone new in their Christian walk. They're on fire just after conversion, and they do what? They want to tell everyone they come in contact with about God and His love for them. However, the young Christian, the young on-fire Christian, reaches people and Christians who really don't care. You see, they're basically saying to this young on-fire Christian, well, we don't mind your excitement, but could you please keep it to yourself? The people the young Christian reaches have more important things to do, they tell him. The servant in the parable can't understand this. Nothing in the servant's mind can be more important than his king's invitation to a party. So we have this wedding banquet, right? This elaborate banquet attended by street people. How did the servant feel about this? The servant question is God cares for the poor and those rejected by society. And this very question that bothered Jesus and the people of his time. See, the people in Jesus' time could not understand how Jesus, good in so many ways, would associate with the downtrodden, the fringe of society. So did our servant lose sight of the fact that he was inviting people to a party? Maybe. My question is, if the servant invites all these people to the party and no one comes, is it still a party? If we come to Jesus, if we come to know Jesus as our personal Savior, then we should find it easy to invite others to have that same kind of a relationship. But we're left with the choice. If we don't accept the invitation, then what happened to the people of the city will happen to us as well. I don't want us to see Christianity as a cheap fix, a serval for ourselves. See, when we choose to follow Jesus, we run the risk of losing family and friends. Leading a Christian life is demanding, to say the least. Brothers and sisters, if you have a friend, a son or a daughter, invite them to the party that God's throwing. But hurry. See, as members of Christ's church, we know about the party that God's hosting. But who's out there that we come in contact with on a daily or weekly basis that needs our invitation to the party? Perhaps a friend, a coworker, or a football fan that doesn't understand Boise State football. That was meant to be a joke. What is it that's keeping all of us from inviting them? They may think, well, geez, if I invite them, they're going to think I'm one of those weird Christians. They may turn us down, and then, gosh, how would that affect my relationship with them? See, oftentimes we're okay, ouch, inviting those that are like us. But to invite those that are different from us, those who are on the fringe of society, those who are recovering from addiction, someone who just got out of the prison system, or who is an alcoholic, we get uncomfortable. The time's come for all of us to no longer be complacent. Don't assume that others will do the work for us. Brothers and sisters, we need to live out the Great Commission found in the end of Matthew's Gospel. So what if they're not like us? So what if they have a different upbringing? The party Jesus Christ invites all of us to, that God invites all of us to, is for everyone. Now, I don't want to disturb any of you, but this is not a secret society. We're not able to share. We're not under an oath to not share what happens inside this building. We should be telling everyone what goes on in this building. The one thing I can guarantee you, brothers and sisters, the devil, he's not waiting. He's got his plan and he's working that plan. But he needs to be stopped. And you and I are the people to stop him. One life, one individual at a time. Remember, think back what it was like right after you accepted Jesus Christ into your life. Think about the fire you had. How you wanted to tell everyone you came in contact with about Jesus Christ and his love for you. Yes, the time for us to assume that someone else will tell them about Jesus Christ, or to say, well, I go to the church, but telling others about Jesus Christ is the pastor's job. See, brothers and sisters, people don't just come to church like they used to. There's so many demands on people's times and their lives, and really, after all, a lot of us are just looking for shortcuts, right? Sunday mornings make a great time to catch up on all that sleep I missed during the week. Jesus Christ is counting on all of us to do our part to advance his kingdom on earth. I invite all of you to join me. Let's go to the party and bring our fellow man with us. After all, it's a party, and who doesn't want to go to a party?